Psychoanalysis was sort of flagrantly unscientific. I mean, they didn't even make the pretense of doing a good study of anything. At the time, you know, in the early 20th century, the dominant school in psychology in America and England was behaviorism. You know, and behaviorism, even though I'm not a behaviorist at all, what you have to say about the behaviorists is that they had a strong sense that psychology had to be based on experimentation. You had to have control groups. You had to have well-validated observations and instruments. This was completely foreign to psychoanalysis. So, you know, psychoanalysis, even though it made a huge impact on the culture, even though it dominated departments of psychiatry, it did not dominate departments of psychology to anywhere near that extent. And that's because departments of psychology in America and England had the strong empirical sense. And so they criticized psychoanalysis. They went, where's your data? Show me some studies. Even some of Freud's followers very early on became disillusioned with it. They didn't see the data. They started to realize that psychoanalysis is basically a set of propositions that were being promulgated by leaders. And if you were a follower, you would simply accept these. If you did not accept them, you were simply written out of the movement. So it was not conducted as a normal science. And that, you know, that produced skepticism among behaviorists and other American psychologists, so that it never got that extent of domination in psychology. Where it really was important and really dominated was in the area of psychiatry. Psychiatry became dominated by the Freudians, but that has disappeared because of the rise of biological psychiatry. I mean, nowadays, when psychiatrists think of depression, they're much more likely to think about what drugs you can use, what parts of the brain are involved in depression. Of course, we didn't have that back in the early 20th century, and so psychoanalysts could say anything they wanted about depression or neurosis. They could make up stories about repressing sex or whatever story they wanted. And that was pretty much accepted. And then you'd bring patients who had neuroses in, you'd talk to them, and hopefully they got better. Maybe they didn't. Mostly they didn't.
A kind of quack from Berlin invited Freud to come to Berlin and visit with him. And Freud wrote back and said, I'd like to come, but I'm afraid my patients will get well in my absence. This gives you some indication of the predatory attitude that Freud had toward his patients. He had a cartoon that he used to keep in his office, a lion, and under the lion it says, Schon 12 Uhr Mittag und keiner Neger. It's already noon and no Negroes. In other words, I'm hungry, I need a Negro to come in here, I need to eat the Negro. Well, what's the Negro? Well, that's the patient. And so the best example would be Horace Frink, this doctor from America. He wants to be a psychoanalyst, so he shows up with Freud, and during the course of his psychoanalysis with Freud, he says, I have this sexual attraction toward my patients. Isn't this bad? I mean, isn't it bad if you screw one of your patients? Isn't that unethical? Not to say even beyond the fact that you're married to someone else. Well, what does Freud say? Well, no, he didn't think it was a bad idea. As a matter of fact, he urged Frink to dump his wife and marry this woman because she had a lot of money, and then give a significant contribution to the Psychoanalytic Society. I mean, this is outrageous. This is an outrageous conflict of interest, an outrageous abuse of the whole idea of medicine, and certainly an abuse of what psychiatry is. And Freud himself was involved in it. This isn't an abuse. This is the heart of the matter, because psychoanalysis is a form of sexual liberation as political control.
I think the genius of Freud was to develop a sort of metaphor or sort of paradigm that people resonated to automatically. Because, you know, obviously the repression of sexuality sort of was an important part of Western culture. If I was just struck watching the movie Kinsey, which is about Kinsey, the sexual reformer. He was not really a Freudian, but you could see that repression of sexuality that was so typical a part of the culture in which he grew up in, where you were concerned about if masturbation was a sin. And I remember growing up in the 1950s in a religious environment, feeling guilty about any kind of impure thoughts about women, sexuality, much less doing things. So that was part of our culture. And I think people, obviously, some people did not fit well with them. They saw that as inhibiting their natural desires and so on. So it became a sort of rallying point, I think, for the intellectual left. People like Kinsey were certainly greeted by psychoanalysts, and you could see him having problems with his religious environment. His father was a preacher. His father viewed, sex as evil, and essentially, and that was part of the zeitgeist at the time. So when Freud, talked about sex as the fundamental basis of all things neurotic, it had a certain surface plausibility. It wasn't ridiculous, I suppose. It wasn't based on science, but it was based, I think, on a sort of attractive paradigm.
Sigmund Freud became the learned Jew when it came to the doctor. In other words, you got a problem, go to the doctor. The doctor has science, the scientist will cure you. Well, that was sort of the myth that got promoted about Sigmund Freud after the fact, around the same time that the Margaret Mead fraud is coming to light. It turns out that that's not exactly what Sigmund Freud was doing.
One of the things I've noticed with Jewish intellectual movements is they tend to be centered around a sort of charismatic leader. Certainly Boas was that way. Freud was that way to the max. I mean, he was the quintessential guru with devoted disciples who were centered around him. They developed the associations of psychoanalysis were very highly organized, top-down societies. People who dissented from these doctrines were excluded. So it was not really scientific in the normal sense. We think of science as open to new ideas, that you could have a study that would disprove something like the Oedipal complex or something like that. That would be perfectly normal in a real science. In psychoanalysis, anybody who disagreed with the Oedipal complex was simply expelled. And usually they would be expelled with saying they had psychopathology. So it was not conducted as a normal science. There were a sort of central organization. People who dissented were expelled. People who were on board were admitted, and but there was a sort of pecking order. If you were close to Sigmund Freud, if you had personal relationship with him, if you had been psychoanalyzed by Freud, that meant you were very close to the top. And so leadership in the society depended pretty much on how closely you were associated with Freud, which of course is very much unlike a real science. A real science, the personalities of the scientists are really not important. It's what they have done. Their ideas are open to refutation. You can change them. You can bring new data. That's the normal practice of science. Psychoanalysis never operated that way. There were a set of core doctrines. It was like a religion, literally like a religion, or like a sort of political view like communism or something like that, where you had to accept certain things. And if you didn't, well, you just weren't part of the group anymore.
It's portrayed as medicine because of the influence that the people who want to promote this have over modern culture. Okay, and so you have all sorts of people now disciples of the new psychology. One of them is a man by the name of Jastrow, who ends up at the University of Wisconsin. This is Heinz's description of what Jastrow was doing at the University of Wisconsin. Jastrow targeted Christianity in a way that Pierce did not, as the prime example of the forcible imposition of thought on a community of people. In his course at Wisconsin on the psychology of belief and in his popular writings, he spoke of, quote, the sad page of history that records the church's techniques of censorship and suppression of thought. He also used the biblical and rabbinical phraseology of the remnant of Israel when he referred to the dissident few who fight in all times and places for freedom of thought. There will always be a saving remnant, he wrote, who are willing to give up dogma. Well, wait a minute. I thought you were in medicine. I thought you were doing medicine here. Well, what you're seeing here is that deviance has been redefined. It will be redefined over the course of the century, and what used to be a sin is now a virtue. For example, homosexuality. What used to be an aberration is now normal, and what used to be normal, namely, let's say, the revulsion at homosexuality, is now a thought crime under the regime of political correctness. So a student at Temple University, my alma mater, who objects to the production of Corpus Christi by the university, was dragged out and taken to the psychiatric clinic at Temple University Hospital for objecting to a blasphemous homosexual propaganda play. Well, this is the essence of political correctness, and it's the essence of what happened during the course of the 20th century. Deviance was redefined as its opposite. Deviance is binary. Deviance is prohibition. There is never going to be a world without deviance. What you have here is the Umwertung aller Werte, the transvaluation of values, where what was good is now bad, or what was good is now wicked. This happened in the realm of psychology, largely through the efforts of people like Freud. So you see this as a way of cultural subversion. Freud became the vehicle for cultural subversion and was interested in those particular terms.
The Frankfort School started in the 1920s in Germany. It was composed entirely of a group of Jewish intellectuals associated with the University of Frankfurt in Germany. They were certainly part of the intellectual left, and seen that way in Germany. When Hitler came to power, he dissolved them. They came to the United States, most of them, and they pursued their studies in the United States. Now, when they came to the United States, they were confronted with a sort of empirical culture that was not so typical of Germany. Germany was more still in this sort of philosophical era. The intellectual life would have been dominated by people like Marx and Hegel and that sort of philosophical idealism or materialism in the case of Marx. And those were where the debates were. Because the English tradition, you can see in American sociology, was much more empirical. You go out and you get numbers. So when they came to America, they really had a need to develop an empirical study. And so they became much more empirically oriented. And so, but their philosophical ideas were developed when they were still in Germany. They were very much informed by their political attitudes. And these people, as I say, they were all Jews. They were deeply identified, strongly identified Jews. And once again, they were fundamentally concerned with anti-Semitism as a problem. And so they viewed their philosophy, and it really was a philosophy before it became an empirical study. It was a philosophy of anti-Semitism. And in that philosophy, they really used fundamental psychoanalytic concepts. So they had the idea that anti-Semitism fundamentally comes from repressing nature. I mean, that's about as psychoanalytic as you can get. By repressing nature, you develop hatred to the Jews. And they even used ideas like projection, which is very much of a psychoanalytic idea. In other words, the idea would be that a non-Jew would have a problem, say, in his economic livelihood or something like that, or he would want power for his own group. Well, he would that is sort of morally questionable, and so he'd repress that and project that onto the Jews. So the Jews would be seen as lusting after power and as oppressing Gentiles, when in fact, according to this theory, it was the Gentiles themselves who wanted power. And it was these, wealthy Gentiles who would get these people to think that it was the Jews who were the problem, when really they were oppressing the Jews, and they were also oppressing, the poorer classes of non-Jews. So this was a theory. It was not based on any data. Once again, it was based on a sort of combination Marxism and psychoanalysis. No empirical data for this. But when they came to America, they couldn't just sell this as a philosophy, because in America you really had to get some data. Psychoanalysis has managed to get by for decades without this, but I think the Frankfurt School felt the need to sort of get some kind of verification. So what they did when they got to this country was they started with the authoritarian personality studies. And again, they got at the very elite universities. They're associated with Columbia University, the University of California at Berkeley. And they came up with these questionnaires and so on, essentially designed to tap people's attitudes about Jews and try to show that these were a sign of pathology. So essentially what they did, they tried to show that people, in the end, with healthy family relationships, people who looked up to their mothers and fathers, people who had a strong religious orientation, that these people